Kia ora tātou and welcome to Hard Hat Talk. I'm your host, Greg Ward. Now, we are talking in this episode with Neil Savory, Managing Director of ICC Oceania, part of the US-based International Code Council. They're a global provider of building safety solutions. Great to have you with us, Neil.
Wonderful to be with you, Greg, and your listeners.
Well, look, we're talking around evaluation and certification for products in the building industry. So let's dive right in. Firstly, can you tell us, who are ICC ES?
ICC ES, where the ES stands for Evaluation Service, is a division of the International Code Council. It's an accredited testing, inspection and certification body. It's been in the industry for the better part of 90 years. So it's got obviously significant experience in the field of product testing, inspection and certification. But I think the other key part of this is that being linked to the International Code Council means that it's got access to the resources of a code authoring body and the membership of the International Code Council, which includes something like 60,000 people, many of whom are building officials.
So with the work that you do, what are the opportunities that the new overseas products legislation creates for products certified through alternative approaches, such as that of ICC ES?
I think in the first instance, it's worth acknowledging that what the government has done in New Zealand is somewhat unique in creating alternative pathways for international products that are certified to be recognised under the New Zealand Building Code. And MB has put enormous effort into developing the pathways for recognition of those products, the two key ones being the building product specifications and the recognition notices, both of which have had their first iterations released quite recently. It's not necessarily the case that there's an immediate opportunity for ICC ES evaluated products to use those pathways because under the BPS, it actually requires the nomination of international standards, and for those international standards to be evaluated and recognised as effectively performing to the expectations of the New Zealand Building Code. And through the recognition notice, actual products that have been evaluated by a conformity body like ICC ES also being evaluated, or the certificate being evaluated by MB to satisfy itself that that product, if it was to proceed onto the New Zealand market, would be considered acceptable. And I think it's important to emphasise that the safeguards that are put in place are there because under those two pathways, those products would achieve mandatory acceptance. They would have deemed to comply capability. What I want to stress, though, is that that doesn't mean that the ICC ES evaluation service reports, which are produced under the ES mark, the proprietary scheme of ICC ES, are not legitimate forms of compliance today under the New Zealand Building Code. It just means they don't come with mandatory acceptance.
So for our members, and obviously for the New Zealand market, how do you interpret the ICC ES certificate?
Well, the best way to kind of explain it is they're not all that different to a code mark certificate. They're performing an identical function. Obviously, they come in a different jacket or cover. They potentially contain some additional or different material, but the fundamentals are the same. There's a description of the product, the scope of the evaluation, conditions of use, test reports, the availability of data, the manufacturer's name, all the product identifiers that you would expect to be provided through a certificate that would enable a building consent official to be able to verify the documentation that they've had put in front of them. I think the important distinction to make between code mark and an ESR is that ESRs are based on evaluation against an acceptance criteria. An acceptance criteria is a technical specification that's been developed for an innovative product, and that becomes a category of products. So you may have 5, 6, 20, 50 products that come under that category that can all be evaluated against that acceptance criteria. And if you want an analogy, the acceptance criteria's technical specifications are similar to watermark technical specifications. For those who are familiar with the watermark plumbing product certification scheme.
Well, thank you very much indeed for the outline there. So what's the process then that ICC takes to get a product certified for New Zealand?
So the process is not all that different to what you would expect in any jurisdiction and under any credible accredited certification scheme. You've obviously got the interaction between the manufacturer and the conformity body, in this case ICC ES, where there's an exploration of what the manufacturer wants their product used for. That involves identifying what are the performance requirements under the New Zealand Building Code that product's going to have to satisfy. Then an examination of what test reports may exist, and if there aren't sufficient test reports or any at all, then those tests are going to have to be conducted in order to enable the evaluation to proceed. Other documentation that's necessary for the conformity body to be able to satisfy itself around the credentials and the adequacy of the product. Also important that an inspection will take place of the factory where the product is being manufactured to ensure that you've got repetition and consistency in the quality of the manufacture of the product. And that will continue subsequent to any certificate that's issued as part of ongoing and auditing and inspection of factory processes. I think it's also important always to be aware that certificates are subject to renewal, so they're not for perpetuity. That means that if the product changes its specification, material content, if there's a change in the location of the factory where the product's being manufactured, all those things can be reflected in an updated version of the certificate.
So in terms of the journey then, perhaps for a US or a Chilean product coming to New Zealand, you've given us a really good outline of the steps required. What sort of timeframes would you look at for certification for such product?
It does depend, Greg, on the complexity and the scope or the intended scope of the use of the product as to the timing. I mentioned before that testing is a key part of evaluation. If no testing has been conducted at the time that the manufacturer approaches ICC ES, those tests are going to have to be initiated, and so that obviously adds to the length of time. But it could take anywhere between several months, 6 months and 12 months, depending on what information is available for the purposes of evaluation. I think if I could also just mention, you talked about a product coming in from Chile, coming in from the US, and for that matter, any part of the world. The ESRs are also different from a code mark certificate in that they have the potential to act as somewhat of an international passport for products. So code mark is only recognised in New Zealand. Code mark Australia is only recognised in Australia. But an ESR under the ES mark scheme actually is recognised in a number of international jurisdictions: North America, Caribbean, Latin America or parts of Latin America, Middle East and North Africa, and Oceania, because Jazance has endorsed the ES mark scheme for use in Australia and New Zealand. And that means that a manufacturer who is interested potentially in exporting a product from New Zealand to international destinations, a code mark certificate's not going to enable them to do that, but an ESR can.
In terms of that certification, though, what sort of costs are involved?
Again, it will depend on the complexity and the scope of the product, excluding testing, which is not part of the certification process itself, acknowledging that there's renewal fees, there's inspection fees, etc. For a typical product, you could be looking anywhere between 10 and 20,000 New Zealand dollars to get your product certified. And again, that's probably comparable with a code mark certificate, depending on the complexity of the product.
Fantastic. You're able to give us this information, Neil. For our Boynes members, who will they contact at ICC ES if they require further information?
Greg, there are two points of contact. One is directly to me, and that can be via my email address, which is nsavory@iccsafe.org. Also, contact can be made directly with ICC ES via an email address, which is es@icc-es.org. There's also a web address for ICC Oceania, which will be up on screen.
Fantastic stuff, Neil. It's always an absolute pleasure to speak with you, and thank you very much indeed for the update.
Likewise, Greg, and thank you for the opportunity.
We've been speaking with Neil Savory, the Managing Director of ICC Oceania. Fantastic to have the information there around product certification. You're here with Hard Hat Talk. Look out for further episodes coming up soon. Ka kite.